As humanity still sees it, death is a travesty that everyone lives with. It's a simple piece of life that is never ignored, just suppressed. The late 1800s are not responsible for such a culture. In times when the average treatment was alcohol and wonder cures, vaccinations took the back seat, while outrageously stupid cures and addictive prescription drugs were in the limelight. On the other hand, the stage was set. After all, Wilhelm Röntgen had just invented the X-ray machine, and Cellucotton was about to make its big debut. Yet it just didn't, until July 28, 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, officially starting the Great War as a direct result of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The time when being an ordinary soldier was about to change dramatically from previous entries. The trenches are dark at night. They whine, twist and turn, almost with no end. Though to soldiers, these trenches were the crux of their survival. They were safe zones, a place of refuge that had the best things in life. Mainly just cards and booze, but it might have well been a wartime heaven. What's after that is an open landscape referred to as nothing other than no man's land. A huge field of dross and blood spanning from 500 to a mere 50 yards in length. Soldiers saw both realities as specific sides of hell, each with a different method of torture. The addition of no man's land did not only affect the soldier's psyche, it also changed the use of artillery dramatically from previous wars, a now necessary piece of equipment that launched an unceasing barragement of ethyl containers and explosives, each fatal in their own way. Nevertheless, the worst part of the trenches was the sickening stench emanating from the sheer amount of decaying meat and poisonous gas that the war produced. No large commitment was done to soften this evident problem. The rest laid in the hands of soldiers, stringing up small leather pouches filled with herbs, and if they were lucky, spices. The long-term effects of this were far more brutal than any outsider could imagine, yet the immediate threat of a loaded gun created a singled-out type of fear. As each faction had their own service rifles, the Austro-Hungarians used a series of Mannlicher rifles manufactured between 1886 and 1895. Germany used weapons out of the same era, mainly the Mauser Model 1888 and Model 1898, and the United Kingdom mainly used the Lee Enfield series, first manufactured in 1895. Throughout the war, these weapons got newer, more capable counterparts, such as the Luger machine pistol, while some, like the Mauser Model 1898, stayed for long enough to be widely adopted into the Nazi government of the 1940s. Though the most powerful weapons that came out of this war were the Type 93 U-boat manufactured by the German Empire, the Mark V tank fighting for the British, and of course mustard, phosgene, and tear gas used by various factions throughout the war. As evident by the medical technology of the time, the world wasn't acquainted with this type of conflict. No one was going to be prepared unless they kept up with the war's immediate demands. Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, and Britain were the frontrunners for medicine. They were the ones pushing medicine forward through World War I. Soldiers in these nations would be given 2 armbands if they were injured, one to describe their injury and one to describe treatments that had already been provided. This simple system persisted during World War I and became the norm for every medical establishment at the time. After receiving these armbands, soldiers were transported to casualty clearing stations or hospitals, either by ambulance or horse. It truly was an experimental time period because of how fast the world was learning. In medical equipment, things were much more sporadic because everything that was typically used was in shorter and shorter supply. This is when new things started to happen because doctors had to improvise with what they had on standby. As shipments of more medicine took days or even weeks to arrive, doctors had to make do with excess waste of previous patients. Before the war, there simply wasn't a good way to transfer and store blood reliably, as it would always spoil, rendering it utterly unusable. This changed shortly after the invention of anticoagulants, such as sodium citrate, which held the ability to preserve stored blood for much longer than usual. This made it completely possible to replace lost blood at a much faster rate than letting the body produce it naturally. It also meant that blood could potentially be donated to others by means of a blood transfusion. This time period held promise in many inventive categories, from stainless steel to the first vegan sausage to a simple series of wristwatches. Yet the most valuable assets to come out of this were medical. As an example, plastic surgery was gifted to deformed soldiers trying to integrate back into society after the war who were too hideous to be able to live a normal life. Reconstructive surgery was developed for a similar purpose. While the first attempts at such a procedure let out somewhat unsightly results, they were much better looking than the mangled faces of those that went untreated. The splint, a bundle of sticks seen as the predecessor to the modern crutches of 1945, changed the fact that 80% of soldiers with thigh injuries died shortly after transport, to only a 20% mortality rate. Even sanitary napkins released to the public in October of 1920 were being developed and used during the war's progression. Wilhelm's accidental discovery of radio waves in 1895 led to Marie Curie's portable X-ray machine used to find fragments of metal, infection, and broken bones in otherwise healthy-looking soldiers. Maggot therapy was simply founded after people started using maggots to sterilize and contain injuries, which turned out to be a very simple and cost-effective way of cleaning infected tissue around or inside an open cut. Later, they were replaced by the invention of penicillin, yet some medical institutes still use them to this day because of the sterile properties maggots retain. Ambulances, usually seen as the most important medical invention in the 1910s, made the extraction of the ill much easier than using a horse-drawn carriage, especially in a war environment because of the value each second held. Though the most important aspect of new medicine is how it's used, how it's applied to the people in need of it. So if there isn't a way to administer it to a large audience, it has no point in existing in the first place. World War I provided a simple system of medicine that is still used and running today. Before the war, doctors would either come to the house of the injured or work out of their own homes. After the war, doctors were employed by professional hospitals that were now seen as the public norm for most countries. World War I changed medical equipment and the way it's submitted to the public for the better. It started the much-needed medical bandwagon that rolled right into World War II 21 years later, and is still moving forward today, which is the most valuable thing that came as a direct result of World War I's involvement with medical advances, tagging it the Rudimentary Introduction to Medicine. Warmest regards, Leaf.